There comes a moment in the lives of many men that cuts like a blade. It's not when she leaves. It's not when she says she doesn't feel anything anymore. It's when you realize that everything you did to keep the relationship alive was exactly what killed it. And worse, you see the pattern repeating itself with different women, in different situations, but always with the same result. Always you chasing. Always you explaining. Always you trying to fix something she never asked to be fixed. The realization hits in a silence that hurts more than any scream. You're sitting alone, replaying the last few weeks, and suddenly you understand. Every message you sent that went unanswered, every time you overlooked a disrespectful attitude, every moment you swallowed your discomfort so as not to ruin the mood, all of that wasn't love. It was fear. Fear of losing. Fear of not being enough. And that fear became the very prophecy you were trying to avoid. What no one told you is that relationships don't die from a lack of effort. They die from effort in the wrong place. They die when one side carries the weight of the connection alone while the other merely watches, tests, pulls away. And you? You were taught that insisting was noble. That waiting was mature. That communicating was the path. But communication without reciprocity is a monologue. Effort without return is waste. And patience without limits is self-destruction. Now comes the uncomfortable part. This didn't happen once. It happened 3, 4, 5 times. Different women, different contexts, but the dynamic always the same. In the beginning, everything was intense. She replied quickly, laughed at your jokes, sought you out. Then, little by little, the interest cooled. Replies took longer. Plans were cancelled. And you? You compensated. You sent more messages. Planned more dates. Tried to be more interesting. And the more you did, the less she valued it. Maybe you thought it was bad luck. That it was coincidence. That the problem was them. But then comes the brutal truth. The problem was in the way you reacted to her distance. Because while you understood her pulling away as a problem to be solved, she understood it as a test. A test you failed every time you chased. Every time you accepted crumbs. Every time you pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. And here is the first sign that something was completely wrong. You started to think it was normal to explain the obvious. Normal to say that you liked her. Normal to ask for attention. Normal to negotiate the bare minimum of respect. The relationship became continuous effort, an exhausting attempt to keep alive a flame she simply stopped feeding. But you kept blowing on it. Alone. The real pain isn't rejection. It's the late clarity that you were complicit in your own devaluation. Every time you overlooked an ignored message, you taught that your presence was dispensable. Every time you accepted being treated as an option, you confirmed that you weren't a priority. And every time you sought validation in her interest, you handed over control of the entire relationship. There's a question that changes everything, but that most men take years to ask. Why are you fighting alone for something that should be mutual? If she wanted to be close, she would be. If she valued your presence, she would show it. And if she respected your time, she wouldn't make you beg for attention. The discomfort comes when you realize you already knew this, but chose to ignore it. Chose to believe words instead of observing actions. Chose the narrative instead of real behavior. This is where the great internal rupture begins. You stop asking, what did I do wrong? And start asking, why did I accept this? And that change of question changes everything. Because finally you take the focus off her and put it on yourself. On your pattern. On your tolerance. On your need for external validation. And when that realization hits, there's no going back. You can no longer pretend you don't see it. You can no longer accept the unacceptable just to avoid being alone. From that point on, something inside you hardens. It's not anger. It's not resentment. It's a strange, almost cold calm. You look back and see with surgical clarity every moment you were naive. Every time you confused momentary interest with real intention. Every situation in which you interpreted pretty words as genuine commitment. And the conclusion is simple, but devastating. You gave too much value to someone who didn't deserve it. And now? Now you know something you can't unlearn. You know that attraction isn't built with explanations. You know that respect isn't earned with infinite patience. You know that genuine interest doesn't need constant maintenance. And most important, you know that her silence was always an answer. You just didn't want to hear it. If you've made it this far and this is making sense, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know which city or country this message is reaching. Because what comes next is what no one taught you about how relationships really work. And once you understand this, you never accept less than you deserve again. The truth is that you were conditioned to believe that love is effort. That a healthy relationship requires hard work. That if you tried hard enough, anything would work. But no one told you that unilateral effort isn't love, it's emotional dependence disguised as commitment. No one warned you that insisting beyond what's reasonable isn't persistence, it's a lack of self-respect. And no one prepared you for the moment when you finally understand. Some people don't want to be won over. They just want to be chased. What happens after this understanding is not revolt. It is observation. You start noticing things that previously went unnoticed. The way she always had an unforeseen issue whenever you planned something important. How she only looked for you in her moments of boredom, never in yours. How every achievement of yours was minimized, but every problem of hers demanded your immediate presence. And the most revealing part, how she constantly tested your limits, waiting for you to react, but you always swallowed it and pretended everything was normal. Those tests were not accidental. They were strategic. A message left unanswered for hours while she posted stories. A commitment canceled at the last minute with no real justification. A subtle comparison with other men dropped into the conversation. Small, calculated provocations to measure how far you would accept being treated with indifference. And you? You always justified it. She must be busy. Everyone has bad days. Relationships are about understanding. But understanding without reciprocity becomes submission. And that's exactly when you realized, every time you tolerated disrespect, she lost more interest. Not because she was bad, but because attraction doesn't operate on moral logic. Attraction responds to firmness, not infinite flexibility. It responds to consequences, not explanations. And you spent months, maybe years, trying to explain the obvious instead of simply acting in accordance with your own value. Here comes a truth that hurts. While you were trying to be understanding, she was unconsciously looking for signs of strength. Not physical strength. Emotional strength. The ability to say no. To refuse mediocre treatment. To simply leave when the balance tipped too far toward disrespect. But you never left. You never set real boundaries. And the more you stayed despite everything, the more she confirmed that she could do anything without consequences. There is a specific moment that marks the transition. You send a message expecting a reply and she simply ignores it for 2 days. Before, you would have sent another. You would have asked if everything was okay. You would have created mental excuses to justify her silence. But this time, something different happens. You do nothing. You just observe. And the absence of your usual reaction creates a void that she notices. Suddenly, she replies. Casual, as if nothing had happened. But you notice the subtle change in tone. She is checking whether you are still there, available, waiting. And in that instant, you understand something fundamental. Real interest doesn't need to be provoked. When someone genuinely cares, their presence is consistent, not intermittent. When someone truly values you, the effort is balanced, not unilateral. And when there is authentic attraction, you don't need to question where you stand. You know. Because it becomes evident in every action, every choice, every demonstrated priority. But this raises another disturbing question. How many times did you confuse sporadic attention with real interest? How many times did you interpret crumbs as a feast? She gave you the bare minimum, an affectionate message here, a compliment there, a good night once in a while, and you treated it as if it were deep connection. You built castles on sand. And when the castle collapsed, instead of questioning the foundation, you tried to rebuild it with even less material. The major turning point happens when you stop trying to understand why she acts this way and start accepting that she simply acts this way. It doesn't matter if it's trauma, insecurity, family patterns, or any other psychological justification. The practical result is the same. You are investing emotional energy in someone who doesn't reciprocate in the same currency. And no explanation in the world changes that basic math. So you make a decision that once seemed impossible. You pull back. Not as a strategy. Not to make her miss you. But because you finally understood that your peace is worth more than any external validation. You stop initiating conversations. Stop making plans. Stop trying to keep alive a connection that died long ago but that you refuse to bury. And something surprising happens. Either she reacts for real, showing genuine interest for the first time in months, or she simply lets you go. And both responses give you the clarity you needed. If she reacts, you observe. Not with hope, but with discernment. Because now you know how to differentiate real interest from panic over losing guaranteed attention. You see whether actions change or whether it's just a temporary performance until you return to your usual role. And if she doesn't react? Then you have your definitive answer. You were never a priority. Just convenience. What's frightening at this stage is realizing how many relationships you sustained alone. How many times you were the only one concerned with staying in touch, creating moments, resolving conflicts. And when you stop, everything collapses. Not because you were essential, but because you were the only one building. She merely occupied the space you created, without ever contributing her own bricks. This understanding transforms you. You don't become bitter, but discerning. You don't become closed off, but selective. You learn to identify real effort in the early stages. You learn to value consistency over intensity. And above all, you learn that silence communicates more than 1,000 words. When you stop filling empty spaces with desperate effort, the true nature of the connection reveals itself. Now you carry a lens you can no longer remove. You see patterns where you once saw individual cases. You recognize tests where you once saw coincidences. You identify lack of interest disguised as a difficult moment. And this clarity, although liberating, is also lonely. Because most men are still in the phase of explaining, tolerating, insisting. They still believe love conquers everything. They still haven't understood that without reciprocity, there is no love. There is only unilateral dependence. The definitive breaking point arrives without warning. You're in a situation that months ago would have destroyed you. She disappears for days, comes back as if nothing happened, and expects you to be there in the same place, arms open. But something fundamental has changed. You don't feel anger. You don't feel hurt. You feel an indifference so deep it scares even you. It's like watching someone try to manipulate you with a trick whose every step you've already memorized. It doesn't work anymore. And when it doesn't work, the entire game loses its meaning. She notices. They always do. Because the absence of your emotional reaction creates a deafening silence. She tries to provoke you, to elicit that old response of pursuit, the desperate effort you always offered. But you don't take the bait. You respond with distant politeness. Cordial, but empty. And this completely disorients her. Because predictable men are controllable. Men who don't react to her disinterest are unfamiliar territory she doesn't know how to navigate. Here something happens that you never imagined possible. She starts doing what you used to do. She sends messages for no reason. Tries to create conversations out of nothing. Suggests meeting up. And every one of her actions shows you with surgical clarity what you used to look like: desperate, available, easy. Seeing it from the other side is brutal. You feel retrospective shame for how many times you lowered yourself that way. How many times you begged for attention. How many times you accepted less than you deserved just to avoid being alone. But the most revealing part isn't that she changed her behavior. It's that you don't care anymore. Months ago, this sudden interest would have felt like victory. Confirmation that your effort was worth it. Now, it's just information. Information that she only values what she doesn't have guaranteed. That her interest was always proportional to your distance, never to your presence. And this emotional math shows you something devastating. You were never loved for who you are. You were valued only as long as you were a challenge. There's a specific moment that crystallizes everything. She calls you, something she hadn't done in months, and her voice has that tone you know so well. That tone that used to melt your defenses. She talks about missing you, about how you drifted apart, about wanting to see you. And you listen. You listen without interrupting. Without reacting. And when she finishes, you simply say you have to go. You don't make excuses. You don't explain anything. You just hang up. And the silence that follows that call shows you that you've finally broken the cycle. You no longer need her validation. You no longer need to prove anything. You no longer need to win a game that was always rigged against you. The great revelation is this: female attraction isn't built with effort. It's revealed by the absence of it. When you stop chasing clarity, clarity appears on its own. When you stop tolerating ambiguity, real intentions become evident. And when you finally establish real consequences for disrespect, the person's true character reveals itself without filters. Either she genuinely values you and completely changes her posture, or she disappears. And both responses serve you perfectly. You begin applying this understanding in real time. You meet someone new and the signs appear early. She cancels a date without proposing a concrete alternative. You don't question it. You don't complain. You simply go on with your life. If she has real interest, she'll react. If she doesn't, you've saved months of wasted effort. She takes hours to reply to something that takes seconds. You mirror her timing. Not out of revenge, but because now you understand, your immediate availability doesn't generate gratitude, it generates devaluation. This isn't a game. It's self-respect translated into behavior. It's the definitive refusal to sustain alone connections that should be mutual. It's understanding that respect isn't asked for, it's demonstrated through clear boundaries. And when you internalize this, your entire relationship with women changes. Not because you became a manipulative strategist, but because you stopped being an emotional doormat. The most intense part of this transformation is when you test it for the first time. You meet someone you're genuinely attracted to, and when she acts with disinterest, you do the unthinkable. You leave. Without discussion. Without trying to understand. Without giving an immediate second chance. You just walk away. And what happens next shocks you. Either she chases you, showing authentic interest that wasn't there before, or she lets you go, confirming there was never a real connection. But unlike the past, both scenarios satisfy you. Because now you're not seeking validation. You're seeking alignment. And alignment isn't negotiable. It either exists or it doesn't. When a woman genuinely values your presence, it's obvious without investigation. Messages flow naturally. Dates happen without complication. Effort is balanced. And most importantly, you don't feel anxious, insecure, constantly questioning where you stand. You know. Because she makes it clear through consistent actions, not occasional words. This clarity makes you ruthless in selection. You no longer give room to ambiguity. You no longer tolerate endless tests. You no longer accept unilateral effort disguised as patience. And when you establish this standard, something surprising happens. The women who truly have interest stand out immediately. Because they don't play games. They don't test beyond what's reasonable. They don't create confusion where there could be simplicity. They simply show interest and reciprocity from the beginning. The climax of this journey isn't finding the right person. It's becoming the man who doesn't accept the wrong one. It's the definitive transition from someone who seeks approval to someone who offers opportunity. From someone who tolerates disrespect to someone who simply leaves when the signs appear. And this internal change is irreversible. Once you see the matrix, you can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. The complete transformation doesn't happen overnight. But when it finally solidifies, you realize you're no longer playing the same game. You operate under completely different rules. Relationships stop being battlefields where you fight for crumbs of attention and become natural filters instead. Women who bring confusion simply don't pass through. Not because you actively reject them, but because they themselves realize the old tricks no longer work and give up. What remains in the end is a strange peace. You're no longer anxious waiting for a message. You're no longer interpreting ambiguous signals, trying to find meaning where none exists. You're no longer negotiating basic respect as if it were an epic conquest. You simply live. And the people who deserve to be in your life show up without drama, without games, without unbalanced effort. Because genuine attraction is simple. It was confusion that was always manufactured. There is one final lesson that ties everything together. You cannot control anyone's interest. But you can completely control how much disinterest you tolerate. And when you establish this internal boundary in an unshakable way, the entire landscape changes. You stop attracting women who seek free emotional validation because you simply no longer offer it. You stop sustaining unilateral dynamics because you cut them off at the first sign of imbalance. And you stop suffering over people who don't value you because now you leave before you get attached. This approach doesn't make you cold. It makes you conscious. It doesn't close you off to love. It protects you from emotional waste. Because real love doesn't require you to abandon your dignity. It doesn't require you to tolerate chronic disrespect. It doesn't require you to be the only one investing. Real love is reciprocal from the beginning, or it isn't love. It's just need disguised as connection. Looking back, you see with absurd clarity all the red flags you ignored. Every time she showed disinterest and you interpreted it as a challenge. Every situation where you should have left but stayed waiting for a change that never came. And the lesson isn't to regret. It's to internalize the patterns so you never fall into the same trap again. Because self-respect isn't a luxury. It's a basic requirement for any healthy relationship. Here is the truth that sets you free. When you stop chasing, one of two things happens. Either the right person appears and everything flows naturally, without forced effort, without constant anxiety, without daily questioning of where you stand. Or you end up alone. And for the first time, loneliness isn't frightening. Because you finally understand that being alone is infinitely better than being with someone who makes you feel invisible. You learn to distinguish loneliness from self-abandonment. Loneliness is a temporary state and often a necessary one. Self-abandonment is accepting mediocre treatment just to avoid being alone. And when you stop abandoning yourself by tolerating the intolerable, the quality of your connections changes radically. Because you're no longer available to just anyone. You're available only to those who demonstrate real reciprocity. The first path is familiar but painful. The second is frightening but liberating. And once you experience the peace of the second, you never go back to the chaos of the first. If you've made it this far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments whether this message made sense to you and where you're watching from. Because this understanding changes everything. And when you fully internalize it, relationships stop being battlefields and become encounters between people who choose to be together, not who need to be together. And that small difference changes absolutely everything forever.